My guest today is the Reverend Dr. Christoph Keller III, an Episcopal priest and theologian who, through his ministry and life, has blended scholarly pursuits with pop culture knowledge in an innovative leadership style. As a young man, Chris Keller could do anything. Having grown up the son of two well-read parents, he has their intelligence and eagerness to learn. His father, the late Chris Keller, was the Episcopal Bishop of Arkansas from 1967 to 81, and a desegregation leader in the Deep South. His late mother never wanted for love or money, having been born Carolyn Murphy of Murphy Oil. So what makes a man like Dr. Chris Keller work hard and strive? He doesn't have to. He has family stability, above-average intelligence, and the love of many doting sisters. But strive he did and still does. At an early age, Chris showed promise and becomes the class president of Little Rock's famed Central High School, where he organized the first soccer league in Central Arkansas. Following high school, he attended Amherst College and majored in American Studies, where his thesis titled Busing awarded him the top prize for an American Studies. For a master's degree, young Chris was Harvard-bound when a persistent calling to become a priest began to creep into his subconscious. Acting on the call, he enrolled across the street in the Episcopal Divinity School. Upon returning to Little Rock, some got to know the now Father Keller as the founding priest of St. Margaret's Episcopal Church on Chenal Parkway in Little Rock, Arkansas. But the ever-learning Dr. Keller was once again restless for more education. In 1999, he would move his family to New York City to begin his advanced study in theology. Dr. Keller holds a Doctor of Theology, a Ph.D., in Anglican Studies with a focus on theology and science. Listen to the name of his dissertation: Darwin's Science in Chalcedonian Imagination, Barth, Double Agency, and Theistic Evolution. This paper explores and affirms the compatibility between Christian faith and evolution. Talk about a tough topic. I got to know Dr. Keller when he was called to be the Dean of Trinity Episcopal Church in downtown Little Rock. Since his retirement from that job, in true Chris Keller mania, if you will, he has written an important book titled Getting On Toward Home, a collection of 12 of his, I suppose, favorite funeral sermons. This book, with its meaning of life and celebration of death, will be our main topic of conversation today. It is an honor to welcome to the table one of the smartest guys I've ever had the pleasure of knowing, my friend, and like E.F. Hutton, when Chris speaks, people listen. The Reverend Dr. Chris Keller III. What? All true.
No, I've never been introduced quite so exuberantly before. And the accuracy is not 100%, but
it's not right.
My sisters never once doted on me.
Oh my gosh.
And there are a few other things, but it's all right. It's close enough for rock and roll.
Is your mother Polly? Was your mother called Polly?
They would call. Her name was Caroline legally, but she was always called Polly.
I'm glad you chose a simpler title for your book, Getting On Toward Hope, than your earlier writings, Darwin's Science and Chalcedonian Imagination, Barth, Double Agency, and Theistic Evolution. Remind me to never read that paper. In reading your book, your father's eulogy and your mother's homily were both included. And there's a difference. Tell us what the difference between a eulogy and a homily is.
So neither of them is a eulogy.
No, they're both homilies.
They're both homilies. A eulogy is, the Greek root is, essentially it means it's praise. And it's so a eulogy, which is a good thing, is kind of a parting message of praise for the person who's deceased. And the homily is a sermon. It's a short sermon where the point is to draw the person's life into the understanding of that person's life that we have through our faith. So you're seeing the person in light of the larger truth about the world and God. And so the homily is supposed to preach.
I gotcha. That's why we call sermons homilies. Yeah. And a eulogy is about praising just that person pretty much. You're not trying to teach them something about the Bible while you're giving them a eulogy.
Right. And the kind of a brief history of speaking at funerals in the Episcopal Church. When I was born, the practice was nothing was said about the person who had died.
Really?
The basis for it, in a way, is beautiful, which is that we're all equal in the eyes of God. We all, and none of us really can accurately summarize another person. That's for God to know and for us to find out. And so, whether you're the Queen of England or the person that sweeps the floor in the pub down the street, you're treated the same at a funeral. Now, theoretically, that was the way it was. And so a parish priest generally just didn't preach at funeral services, and neither did any member of their family. That was kind of hard for people to bear. And so just about the time that I became a priest, there was a new prayer book, and it actually offered an opportunity for the first time for there to be a homily at a funeral service. And so people kind of had to figure out how to use that time. A lot of times I've noticed they tended to be almost impersonal. I mean, the preacher would preach the resurrection. It seemed to me that you always needed to bring the person's life into that.
Yeah, I don't like funerals like that. They did that for my grandmother's funeral, and I was like, well, we didn't even talk about Grandma.
Yeah, and I think that pastorally, even when I was young, I recognized that it needs to be more personal than that. I think probably as a reaction to that, people more and more started, in addition to having sermons, would have kind of tributes from family members at services to make it personal. And I think I've heard some really good ones. But more often, in my experience, I've not. If somebody asks when we have a member of our family do a tribute, the answer has always been yes, just one, please, so that the service isn't too long. Mm-hmm. But more often they don't, and I get people that even if I don't know the person that I'm about to talk about, I'll get to know them in the 3 days before the service.
Oh, is that how long it takes? 3 days of interviewing the family?
Yeah. Well, it takes 3 days to actually have the service, and so I'll get the people in the family to talk to me about their loved one, and then I'll give their loved one back to them, kind of wrapped up in the gospel, in the homily. But then there are other people that I've known all my life, and so I don't have to ask.
Well, now you got the internet. You can just go online and Google up the person and go, hey, look at what all they did.
You sure can. You can get it. Yeah, you could. Your
father was a second-generation preacher?
Third.
You are the fourth preacher in your family? Mm-hmm. No pressure to your son.
Well, there was no pressure on me. Seriously, there wasn't. And my son, who's a practicing attorney, would say there was no pressure on him.
Except for he's got to feel it back in the back of his brain.
Well, that's between him and God.
Spoken like a true preacher. All right, before we get into the nuts and bolts of your book and why it was important for you to write it, I want to tell our listeners. I interviewed you the first time in January of 2018 when you were sitting dean of Trinity Episcopal Cathedral. And in that interview, we talked about your family, which we just talked about. We talked about your opinion on gay marriage and your aforementioned thesis paper of how science and Christianity are compatible. And I don't want to belabor those topics again, but I do want to tell everybody it was a great interview. In fact, I've had people tell me it's their favorite interview of all the 200 I've done. It was really, obviously you're well-spoken and you have deep thoughts. But I do want to very briefly give our new listeners some insight into the depth of your thinking. You and your father have always been champions of civil rights movement. Why was that social issue been important to your family?
Well, it's important to all of us, especially Southerners, but it just happened that my father was the dean of St. Andrew's Cathedral in Jackson, Mississippi from 1961 to 1967, which was when the civil rights movement finally got the steam to, gathered enough steam to make the changes needed that were difficult to make that had to be made in the South. And so there was no way not to take a stand where he was. And, and something as basic as are the doors of our church open to all people of any color was a controversial stand to take in Jackson, Mississippi in 1961. And there was a church, it's called the church visit movement, that was organized in the way that freedom rides were in Jackson. And it was right after Medgar Evers, who was, I think, the president of the Mississippi NAACP, was murdered in Jackson, that 4 women who had tried at other churches in Jackson to go to church on Sunday morning and been turned away, they came to St. Andrews and they were welcomed. And so just by doing the essentially Christian thing of recognizing that red and yellow, black and white, all are precious in His sight, that got my father in the New York Times.
Oh, wow. Front page of the New York Times, I bet.
Yeah, I think it was the front page. And so he was just standing there doing the right thing, and it attracted some attention.
For your PhD thesis, you wrote how science and Christianity can exist together. I know this is a big topic, but very quickly, tell us how you came to that conclusion.
Well, the Christian faith was ready for a science which was able to explain the origin of species in a natural way, because from back into ancient times, it had understood that when we talk about God as creator of the world, we're not talking about God as an agent, one among other creative things in the world, but as the creator of the whole shebang. So God is, now it's true that God is a doer in the world, but God is the doer of the world. And so Thomas Aquinas, drawing from Aristotle, referred to God as the primary cause of events in the world, in the same way that the author of a novel is the primary cause of events that happen within the novel. But if you're inside the novel and you're living in it, you're not seeing. If you're in a Harry Potter novel, you're not seeing J.K. Rowling anywhere. You're doing stuff because it makes sense to do, or that happens within the context of the book. Well, Thomas Aquinas, who didn't know anything about Charles Darwin, knew that God is that way in this world. And it's, the first part of the Summa Theologia, he says, "Does God exist?" Well, Aquinas always started with objections to whatever position he was going to take. He says, well, it seems that God does not exist because, number one, there's too much evil in the world, and if God is a God worthy of the name, then God is good. So the evil in the world, the things that happen that are terrible, those contradict the idea of God. And it seems like we don't need God for an explanation, because for almost everything we have a natural explanation. So he starts with those 2 objections, and then he goes on to answer the objections. And the answer to the objection, well, we don't really need God as an explanation. He says, well, actually we do. We don't need God as an explanation for this, that, or the other thing that happens within the world, but we need an explanation for the world as a whole and for certain ways in which the world makes sense. Without God, we can't really explain that. So God is like, to this world in which species evolved, is like J.K. Rowling to the world of Harry Potter, and Christianity knew that before Darwin ever presented the problem.
Well said. Before we go to break and begin to talk about your book and come back and talk about your book, an even tougher subject than race relations or Christianity and science, it's going to be gay marriage in the church. You, at one time, Episcopalians were quick to come to the party, but you were a little slow getting there. Tell us how you decided that it was right and holy.
Yeah, I probably am instinctively conservative about everything, in the sense that, if somebody was going to propose a change, that I'm going to say, well, tell me more about that. And why should we change? So I've always been a cautious conservative about virtually everything. So I grew up into a world in which marriage was between men and women, and actually the norm for sexual relations that I was taught was it was right if it was between men and women, and it was wrong if it was any other combination. And so that was kind of the given into the world and the church that I came into. But I was always taught to be an open-minded conservative. And I was also always taught that we see change happen within the Bible. I mean, the Bible is not static itself, and there are major controversies in the early church where significant changes to the practices of what it meant to be a faithful person were introduced within Christianity and considered and debated. And you could see that God had empowered the church to take up the question of change and to resolve it. That's part of what it means to be a human being, is to consider new information and to reckon with it, work with it. So in the early 80s, the Episcopal Church was considering resolutions at the General Convention, which meets every 3 years, pertaining to homosexuality. And early on, it was controversial. This is before I got in it, but my father was active. They passed resolutions that said that the people that have same-sex attraction have an inherent dignity and need to be respected as having that by the church. So that was kind of the first step. And when I came along, the question was, should clergy in particular abstain from sexual relations outside of marriage? The first time I was ever asked to take a vote on that. And so that's basically reaffirming that if you're clergy, that you should be chaste unless you're married. And the only way you could be married was if you were married to a member of the opposite sex. So the conservative vote that I took at a convention was to say, yeah, we should be that we should be chaste. And so that was the conservative vote at the time. The next convention, which was 3 years later, which I was again a deputy, the question was, should the church be willing to bless same-sex unions? And I was a member of the committee there, and that was going to be the most controversial question that we faced. And there was a weekend within the convention, and I was by then the vicar at St. Margaret's Church, and I needed to come back, church which was brand new and meeting in a movie theater, and I needed to leave the convention to come back to Little Rock to hold services because it was really important for me not even to miss a Sunday. And on the plane down and back, I just kind of said my prayers on that question. And I came back and I proposed to the committee that what we should do is call for a study of that, a theological study of that issue to present to the next convention, stating how the church saw that, why it saw that we should be open to considering that question and what we should do about it. In other words, let's the church adopt we're an open-minded church on this for 3 more years, and we're going to study it, and they're going to reconsider it at the next convention. And the resolution that I proposed to the committee passed the convention. And so 3 years later, I'd read the results of the study, and frankly, the study that the church produced was not well done. And so to me, it was not persuasive in any way. It was kind of, well, there's pros and cons, and it just kind of threw the thing up in the air. And I thought, well, okay, well, I'm going to take a sabbatical. I'm going to decide myself what I think about this.
In true Chris Keller form.
And so I took a sabbatical, 3 months leading to the convention, and I read as much as I could and didn't do really anything else for those 3 months. And I studied, kind of the science about what do we understand about why people are attracted to others of the same sex. I mean, do we have a definitive answer to that about that? I studied the theology of it, and what understanding of what it is about love that makes it holy. What is it about same-sex love that would exclude it from consideration of being considered holy and sacramental. And I said my prayers on it, and a very interesting thing happened. About 2 weeks before the convention, I got a call from a friend of mine who was a priest in Mississippi. His name is Duncan Gray III. He later became the Bishop of Mississippi, the third Duncan Gray, who was Bishop of Mississippi. There was Duncan Gray the first, second, and third were all bishops of Mississippi. Duncan Gray, I didn't know that well. And he said, he called me at home. He'd called my office, and they said, well, he's on sabbatical. And here's his number. And they called me at home, and he said, Chris, are you okay? I said, well, yeah. I mean, I didn't know Duncan Gray, except maybe having spoken to him a couple of times in my life. And I said, yeah, I'm fine, Duncan. Why do you ask? He says, because I had a dream about you last night, that you were sitting at your desk with a stack of books on your desk, and you were intensely thinking about something. And I just want to know if you were okay. And
you're like, well, that's not a dream. That's true.
And Duncan Gray and I are now good friends. And I see him from time to time.
Brothers.
And he'll affirm that happened. And so that was my posture going to the convention. And what I decided was, this is when two people love each other, kind of under the terms that we understand for opposite sex marriage, for traditional marriage, where they promise to love each other unconditionally, to engage in that give and take, that love is holy and that the church should bless it. And so that was when I changed my mind.
What did you say to Duncan when he called and said that to you?
Well, I told him what I was up to.
What did he say about that?
Well, he was glad that I was thinking about it, because he'd been worried about it too. I mean, and he was, we're similar people from the same part of the world, and we've been raised the same way, and we're going to both have to vote on that question. And we kind of ended up coming to the same place about it.
I bet nobody has studied it as much as you have.
Well, no, there are plenty of people that have studied more. But I bet there wasn't anybody at that convention that had studied as much as I had.
I wish our representative in Congress would study stuff that hard.
Well, just because you study something, I mean, it's well, you know what? You're right. If you're talking about things that matter, and if you're in the Congress of the United States or the legislature of the state of Arkansas, then you have an obligation to do the best you can to understand it as well you can, to say your prayers on it, and to offer it up.
Because it's going to change. It's going to affect. Because your decision is going to affect a lot of people. And that's a good story. All right, this is a great place to take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with the Reverend Dr. Christoph Keller III. We will talk about his recently published book titled Getting On Toward Home, a collection of 12 of his funeral sermons, each with a mountain of meaning written in every word. Get Father Keller's take on the meaning of life and afterlife, and ask why a man with his extensive education and intelligence has such concrete faith. Maybe it will rub off on us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Up in Your Business with Kerry McCoy, a production of flagandbanner.com. Over 40 years ago, with only $400, Kerry founded Arkansas Flag and Banner. During the last 4 decades, the business has grown and changed, along with Kerry's experience and leadership knowledge. In 1995, she embraced the internet and rebranded her company as simply flagandbanner.com. In 2004, she became an early blogger. Since then, she has founded the nonprofit Friends of Dreamland Ballroom, began publishing her magazine, Brave, and in 2016 branched out into this very radio show, YouTube channel, and podcast. In 2020, Kerry McCoy Enterprises acquired OurCornerMarket.com, an online company specializing in American-made plaques, signage, and memorials for over 20 years, and more recently, opened a satellite office in Miami, Florida. Telling American-made stories, selling American-made flags. TheFlagandBanner.com. Back to you, Kerry.
You're listening to Up in Your Business with me, Kerry McCoy. I'm speaking today with the Reverend Dr. Christoph Keller III, who recently published his book, Getting On Toward Home, a collection of some of his favorite funeral homilies and eulogies. Okay, before the break, we talked about Chris Keller's family a little bit. We talked about why civil rights was important to his family. He's a third-generation priest. We talked about science and religion. We talked about gay marriage. And if that's not enough, you should go back and listen. It was really good if you haven't, if you're just jumping into the podcast. But now we're going to talk about his book, which is the real purpose of why we're here. It's called Getting On Toward Home. Why that title, and why was this book important for you to write?
Well, I just retired, and so all my life I had thought that at some point as a scholar I should write a book and publish. You know, that's kind of part of the job, and I just hadn't ever gotten around to it. So book writing was on my agenda for retirement, and I decided I didn't want to write a scholarly book. I kind of thought maybe I was just kind of past the sell-by date on doing that. And so I started thinking about possibly publishing a collection of sermons, and I just started working with that idea a little bit, and that wasn't generating much enthusiasm on my part, just kind of looking at a collection of sermons about this, that, and the other thing, my favorite sermons. And I kind of a greatest hits collection. I wasn't too interested in it, and I figured if I'm not interested, nobody else is going to be. And so I thought, well, maybe let's see if I can actually make a book that's not just a collection, but that's kind of a book about something.
A theme.
Yeah. And I thought about different ideas, and I thought about doing a book of sermons about sex, and particularly about the church and same-sex relations, because I've written a lot of sermons about that through the years, and that was one idea. I've done a lot of sermons about religion and science, so that was an idea. But doggone it, I just kind of intuitively started getting drawn to the idea of bringing together some funeral sermons. It's interesting. We've talked about sex and race. One of my favorite books that I've read in the last 10 years is by Reinhold Niebuhr. It's about the progressive view of history. I've forgotten the title of the book, but he says that there are three things, and he says there are three things that the progressive movement will never be able to make go away. And one of them is that sex is important to human beings, and another is that race is important to human beings, and the other is that death is important to human beings.
I thought you were going to say money.
Well, yeah.
But death, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So death is important to human beings, and it's important in Christian faith. What Christianity has to say about death is important. And I've said a lot about it because I've done a lot of sermons when people have died. And so I got drawn with that. And I decided I didn't want it to be a big book. I wanted it to be a small one because there's only so many sermons at funerals that I think anybody ought to ever have to consider reading. And so let's make it small. And these aren't necessarily the ones that I think are my best or my favorite.
I wondered.
It was sort of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where one thing would lead to another, and I would think, I thought this kind of connects with something I said about that and another, and I just started piecing them together, and it was kind of intuitive. And I at one point I had too many sermons about suicide that I was considering, and so I trimmed that back. I thought, well, yeah, that needs to be in there, but that needs not to dominate.
Mm-hmm.
And I had too many. I had 3 or 4 about family members, and I thought, well, that's too many family members. Mm-hmm. And sort of like that. And
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, ultimately, I just kind of looked at it. One day, I arrived at these are the 12, and then I just kind of reprint them, reproduce them like I said them. And I thought, well, no, you have to kind of rush into these things. And it's one thing to kind of hold a room in the moment. And it's another thing to hold a room in the pages of a book. And so it's got to be sharper. It's got to be better written. And you've got to, so I had to rewrite them all. I rewrote them as many times for the book as I'd rewritten them in drafts to do the sermon. So it's usually 5 drafts for a sermon. And so it's probably 10 or 15 for the book.
If I ask you to read something on that exact subject, will you read it?
Okay.
All right, here. It's circled. It's the first paragraph in your author's note, and it's pretty much what you just said.
Okay. This is a little book of sermons with one big thing in common. Someone's death was their occasion. It could go without saying the difference between preaching a funeral and publishing a book is enormous. In these pages, I am not speaking to a room full of mourners that includes a family in the front whose hearts are in their throat. At a funeral or a memorial service, there is power in the room and it reaches to the pulpit. Sometimes I fill a big cup of ice, no water, just ice, and have it in easy reach. So if emotion wells up, I can stop and crunch some ice. Somehow that helps me keep composure. And I don't need ice to write a book.
Yep.
That's true.
That's good. Isn't that good?
It's really good. I feel like I've seen you with the cup of ice before, too. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, like my last sermon at Trinity, I needed ice.
Yeah. Who was that for?
That was my last sermon at Trinity.
Oh, your last sermon. Listen, we were all crying. I'm going to cry just talking about it, but then I'm a crier. I'm just going to keep a cup of ice around me all the time. I read this quote on the back of your book, and it's the favorite quote that, you know how the authors are, you know how they always put a quote on the back of a book, and this one's by Eliza Bournay, and I really liked it. It said, Christoph Keller III has a literary sensibility, an appreciation for pop culture, and a theologian's intellectual heft. I'm using that word sometime. Joy and grief coexist in these pages, along with faith and hope, light and sacred meaning.
Yeah, when Eliza sent me that blurb, which I appreciated a lot, I was kind of taken aback by the pop culture thing, and then I thought, yeah, I'm busted.
You talk about the Grateful Dead, you talk about Tom Jones, you talk about, all these sermons. Every sermon has got some sort of pop culture something in it, I realized after I started reading it. So, and then to go on, before we get into each of your chapters and a little bit more about that, in the introduction, you reference your best friend, and for whom the book is in memory of, the late Richard Franklin Milwee. You call him a feisty gentleman and splendid friend.
Yeah, that's a pop culture reference. It's an Easter egg in there for people that are fans of Lonesome Dove that will know that when I call him a feisty gentleman, I've already said that almost his last words to me, where he was quoting Augustus McCrae's last words in Lonesome Dove to Woodrow Calls, Augustus says to Woodrow, "It's been quite a party, ain't it?" And Augustus McCrae, at some point in the movie, describes himself to Lorena, the prostitute with a heart of gold. He describes himself as a feisty gentleman. So Richard was a great fan of Lonesome Dove, so by calling him a feisty gentleman, I'm identifying him with Gus, and I just put that in there.
So I like this you do not put his funeral in here, even though you presided. Y'all made a promise to each other that whoever went first would do the other would do the funeral.
Yeah.
But he went first, so you did his, but you didn't put it in here.
No, I didn't. I thought I would. And but it's just that kind of that editing process. Just kind of I was going to keep it to 12. I also had I also did his daughter's funeral, who died of cancer before she was 40 years old, and I was going to do that one, and then that one also just kind of the sifting process just ended me not using it.
So you did put Milwee in the introduction, and I thought this was really cute little quote you put in here about him. You said about him having to go in, and I didn't know this, but before you become a priest, you have to go through all these psychological
evaluation, psychiatrist.
Yes, you know, and so you put in here when he's doing his, after a polite, warm tosses the psychiatrist, wound up and threw a curveball. Now, Richard, tell me about your sexual experience. Richard, still single in his early 20s, pondered that and let it hang unanswered. Well, the doctor insisted. Richard, I'm not going to tell you about my sexual experience. And why not, said the psychiatrist, as I imagined him leaning forward on his knees, wanting to know. Because I haven't had enough of it to satisfy a Freudian psychiatrist, and I've had too much to suit the church.
Don't you wish that one time in your life that you had ever said something that perfect?
That was perfect. How long does it take to write a sermon, you think? 3 days, you mentioned.
Well, that year I went to Harvard, the rule they told us is if you're going to stand up in front of people and talk, it's 1 hour of preparation for 1 minute of delivery.
What?
And I've always thought that was the rule that I should follow in preaching, and I stuck to it through the years. And actually, the older I got, the more time I'd spend.
Yeah.
And so, I'd say, a Sunday sermon for me for Trinity Cathedral was usually 15 hours. And at funeral sermons, you have less time because, these customs have changed some in recent years, but, often you would have 3 days to write a funeral sermon. So there I didn't have as much time. So I would probably have 8 hours. And so sometimes I would have to use something that I'd used before.
Doesn't seem like it to me in reading this book. Nothing seems to overlap.
Well, right. But there will be people who might read this book and say, well, yeah, I remember when he said something like this at my mother's funeral.
It seems like it would have to be that way somewhat.
Yeah.
A Christian death is a Christian death, and you've got to have some overlap in there.
Yeah.
You said the Holy Spirit works through you to do this. Is that how you stay humble? Or are you humble? How about that?
The older I get, the easier it is to be humble.
That's called forgetful, Chris. That's not humble.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm humble or not. Who knows about that?
You paint pictures of the person. I talk about that process of painting these pictures. You really, really paint beautiful pictures of people. I had so many to read, I couldn't decide on any of them. This one you read about your father. And this is the only time I cried in the book. And I'm a crier. This is the only time I cried in the book. And you want to read it? You want me to read it?
You go ahead.
No, you read it. No, wait.
Okay, I'll read it. You have to.
One of y'all has to read it.
It's you writing about your dad and this paints a beautiful picture to me that I thought, I wish my kids would do that.
No, they will.
Duly noted.
This is going to happen for you, Kerry.
Opening my ears right now.
This will be easy.
I'll probably outlive everybody. What are you talking about?
Yeah, that's the truth right there.
So my father had Alzheimer's disease, and so for 8 years, really, he'd been disabled by it, and so it'd been a real long time that he could even join us at the table. And so now he's at the point of death, but not. So he's in another room in the house, but we're all gathered because we know the end is there, and we're in a big room, and we're able to kind of remember him as he was instead of just dealing with the stress of the day to day. And so we're in the dining room, and this is now I'm reading. Tableside, we sipped or slurped good wine and gorged on the bayou soul food he adored. He would clean his plate of pork chops fried, field peas, cornbread, and okra fried. He would beg for seconds by evoking Oliver. Please, ma'am, I'd like some more. He would hope for dessert. Might there be a tiny scoop of low-fat sherbet? And at that, we would guffaw as he gave a wink, and Mother rolled her eyes because by sherbet, everybody knew he meant high-fat pie, pecan, honeycut slice with a scoop or three of ice cream. It had been years since he could join us at the table. Now at the end, we began to laugh again and raise our glass to that good man we finally felt permission to remember. Do you want me to explain honeycut slice?
Yeah, what is that?
My wife is Julie Honeycutt Keller, and I actually have a footnote for this in the book. But in our family now, if you want a thin and healthy slice of cake, that's called a Keller slice. If you want a big fat slice of cake, that's a Honeycutt slice, because we were young marrieds, and Julie, we were down on the farm, and it was somebody's birthday. I don't remember whose. And there was a caramel cake that was cooking all afternoon. And Julie loves cake, and she particularly loves caramel cake. And at dinner time, she'd been waiting for that cake all day. Now, you radio listeners need to know that my wife, Julie, is about the most beautiful woman you ever saw.
Absolutely.
So, but she loves cake. And so this cake comes out that she's been smelling all afternoon, and my mother carves her a little slice, and you could see through it. And Julie goes, that's a Keller slice. I'd like a Honeycutt slice. That's 3 or 4 of those. And so ever since, in our family, Honeycutt slice is big, Keller slice is healthy and good for your figure. And we're not interested in that on the Honeycutt side.
That's good.
That sounds so perfect. Yeah.
I know. Well, I figured that's what it meant when you said Honeycutt slice, that it was something big. I didn't know it was in reference to your beautiful wife's portion sizes. All right, it's time to go on to your book, More So.
Okay.
And there are 12 chapters. I don't know if we want to get into each one of them, because look, he goes, no. But
please don't.
But the titles are the name of the person, and then or the chapters are the name of the person. Like the first one is Charles Irwin, and then you gave it a title, Getting On Toward Home. When you're doing their homily or their eulogy, do you title your papers at that time, or did you just do it for the book?
I did it for the book. It was to find something to kind of hang your hat on about what this one is about, and for Harry Charles Irwin, it's the first sermon, and I start by talking about Donald Harrington, the author who has this town of Staymore, Arkansas, that's a fictional town, and it comes from the practice in the Ozarks, as Harrington describes it. If you go visit somebody at night, we're talking about in the 1920s or 30s, you walk down the road and you eat dinner, and when you stand up and it's time to go home, the custom is you say, well, it's about time for me to get on down home, and they go, no, stay more. And then there's back and forth when I need to get going. No, stay more. And anyway, but finally they get on down home. And I was in that sermon, just kind of the way that it worked. I worked towards the conclusion of the sermon of that we want it when somebody we love dies. It's our nature to hate that. And that nature is actually a good thing. That's a healthy part of being human, is to not want somebody to die. I don't want ourselves to die. Thomas Aquinas taught us that. We struggle against death, and that's because we value life. It's not faithless to struggle against death, to consider death the enemy. No, that's faith recognizing the value of life. And so we want to stay more. But it's also true that through all our lives, whether we know it or not, whether we remember it or not, we're actually on a journey to go back to where we started, which we started in God and we go back to God. And so it was time to for Harry to be getting on toward home. So that was kind of the natural title for that sermon, and I decided I wanted to make that the title of the book, and for each chapter, for each sermon, I came up with another title that picked up something in that sermon and crystallized it.
Gave it a theme. For Porter Brown, Catherine Fuller Porter Brown, where is Boots?
Yeah.
I love this when you've referenced Old South Spice as if it was a flavor. It's really a cologne, Old Spice. But you reference it as a flavor. And I'm like, I'm going to make that spice.
Well, I wasn't talking about the cologne. I was talking about the flavor that where we come from.
Right.
Adds to our soul. Because our soul is not something that floats above who we are. It is who we are. It's what we are, is a soul. And she, Catherine Porter Brown, grew up in the South, deep South, but her daughter had moved and made her life out in Seattle. And so when Dr. Brown and Mrs. Brown got old, they went out to live out there, but they took the South with them when they lived out there. And so Where's Boots? She's across the river. She was buried. That service was at the Arkansas River. She wanted to be her ashes brought back to Arkansas, and her husband the same, but they died a few years apart. They wanted to be buried not in Seattle. Oh. They wanted to be buried in Arkansas.
So where's Boots?
And they wanted to be buried at the river. So we had the family service at the Arkansas River on one of those April days in Arkansas where, there are giant thunderstorms that are approaching. They were like 10 miles away, and you could see them and hear them while we were having the service down by the river. And the question was, where's Boots? Well, she's across the river. So now the river is literal and more.
I knew Mr. Terry, Bill Terry. Why did you call him a 5? Oh, was he a 5th? Was he Bill William Leake Terry? Was he the 5th?
It was not. Oh no, that 5. The title is V.
Oh, it's V.
V for victory, because he saw Winston Churchill. He after serving in World War II, he was on a troop ship that Churchill turns out was also on, and he was talking about Churchill flashing the victory sign when they saw him get off the ship. And so victory, I picked up on that. And, so the other victory is Christ's victory over death.
And I love the miniseries reference to the crown, because he was the most gentlemanly gentleman you ever met. And you referenced how he's just so gentlemanly, just he seemed regal. That's
Yeah.
And Virginia, there was so I'm not sure we want to do all of them, but I did like talking about. Oh, I did like this very next one though. She swallowed up in victory. I thought that was really cool. What does that mean, swallowed up in victory? I mean, I can't remember how you used it, but I liked it.
Well, we heard, you and I both went to a funeral this morning for Lenora Steinkamp, and that phrase was in the reading this morning, that death, it's from Paul's in Corinthians, death is swallowed up in victory. So, I mean, that's just a perfect expression of the power of the love of God that is, which, death just seems to us like annihilation, because that's what we can see. And the gospel is that no, it's not, that it's been swallowed up in victory.
I just love that.
I believe that.
Elizabeth, this one broke my heart. And you said it's Marilyn Elizabeth Mitchell, hers for the taking. And it talks about her mental illness and her struggle with schizophrenia.
Yeah.
And you said that if of all the diseases, that one is the hardest. And I'd never really thought about it quite like that.
Mental illness, I mean, schizophrenia is a really bad one, but any mental illness, because, it decapacitates. I mean, in our spirituality, in our engagement with God, our mind is such an important part of that. It's not the whole of it by a long shot, but it's important to it. And mental illness disables that.
Yeah, you can't pray well, you can't cope well, you can't reason well. I mean, you can cope with all these things that happen to you outwardly around you, like cancer and stuff, because you can pray about it and you can try and get your mind wrapped around these kind of positive affirmations.
Yeah.
But when you're mentally ill, you can't ever seem to jump across that bridge.
Yeah.
Or get across that bridge.
Yeah. And so, and Alzheimer's disease is a form of mental illness too.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I mean, like all mental illness has an organic root to it. So they're all alike in that way. So, yeah, Marilyn Mitchell, who I'd gone to high school with, and she had she struggled with mental illness even then. And so now, in her mid-60s, finally died from a brain tumor. For me, one among many ways in which our affirmation of life beyond death is important to Christian faith is that it's how we see that for her, the potential of who she is. I mean, believe me, she lived a brave and valuable life as it was as a person with mental illness. I mean, her life was not a waste, even with her mental illness. But there's a potential in Maryland that she wasn't able to realize in this life, and that's hers for the taking now. That's the title of that sermon is hers for the taking.
That's lovely. Was writing your father's hard? We read a little bit from that, but was it hard to put it together and do it?
Well, this was it was in 1995 that he died. So that's the oldest sermon in the book, I think. His struggle with Alzheimer's disease was awful for me. I mean, it was like my hero was disintegrating painfully in front of my eyes. So everything about that was agonizing for me. But his death felt like release to me. And I actually wrote his sermon literally at St. Timothy's Church in Alexandria, Louisiana. Went down there. He died after we all got there and gathered. He died. And they had a vigil for him overnight. And so people could take turns. His body was in a casket in the church, in the sanctuary of the church, and people could sign up. Well, I'll do it from 8 to 9 and another one from 9 to 10.
That's an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, and it might have been my suggestion. But anyway, I signed up for the whole graveyard shift from like midnight to 6 in the morning, a big chunk in there. And I sat in there with this casket closed because we're Episcopalians and that's what we do. This casket was sitting there in front of me, and I had a note paper, and then I wrote that sermon sitting there with his body in there in the middle of the night in that church.
That sounds awesome. You just don't. I like that so much. It's long too. And
it's long.
And you have cited like 3 pages of people you cited, and it also like I was like, I didn't even read all the citings. I was like, whoa, you used a lot of other people's words. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I did. One of the interesting things about the book is, publishing the book is that, you can't just put that stuff in there and assume it's okay to use.
Right. You're very good about that.
So I had to put the footnote, but where I used a lot of material, I had to go get permission.
Oh, really?
From the publisher.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I bet so. If you're going to actually publish it, I bet you do. It's not like just me talking on the radio. If you're going to publish it, you got to go get. Yeah, I didn't think about it. It's like using somebody's song.
Yeah, right. And if you use any part of a song, you have to get copyright permission. If you're using part of a novel or something, it kind of depends. And so I had a young lawyer put in a plug for Josh Hollenbach at Mitchell Williams, who was a copyright expert, and he and I sorted through that. Well, maybe you've got a little bit too much here. We'll have to get permission, or if you would rewrite it, then we won't have to.
Wow. Yeah. Didn't even think about any of that. You've got tons of that in here.
Yeah.
I bet that took months and months and months.
I started working on this a year and a half ago.
I love this about your dad. You said in his presence he had he mysteriously imparted strength.
Yeah.
That's kind of like you. You also said this about him. From the pew, because I've seen you do this a bunch. You're talking about you as a child. From the pew, we would watch him, that's your dad, in the pulpit, pause, look away to find the words, never in a hurry, just wait, let them come. Yeah. I like that a lot too. All right, your next one was your mother, an exacting woman of standards. I like her.
Yeah, she wasn't particularly doting either. My sisters and my mother are all wonderful and loving, but not a bit doting.
No, she's not doting. Well, she is Caroline Polly Murphy. She knows what she wants, and she wrote a memoir. And she's probably the only person that read your very long thesis on. I can't even remember what it is now. What was your thesis called?
Darwin's Science and Chalcedonian Imagination. Yeah, she read it word for word.
Stem to stern and commented on it.
Yeah.
She's a good mother. And she wrote a memoir from here to there.
Yeah.
Did you use any of it?
Yeah, I started out with her description of meeting my father at a dance at Mary Baldwin College. He came up from Washington and Lee. They both had dates with other people, and they kind of caught each other's eye, and they had a dance, and that was the beginning. So
did your mother remarry after your father died?
Yeah.
Oh, she did.
She married Clark Winter, who was a wonderful man.
Nice.
Mother and dad had been married for more than 50 years, and Clark and his wife Marjorie had been married for more than 50 years, and they were both widowed. And they met. Clark had gone to Washington and Lee too, and Mother hadn't known him there, but they met at an alumni event. He called her up, and they had 10 very, very happy years of marriage until he died.
Nice. So James, how did you pick James Schreiber in The Power of the Spirit to be the last one?
I think I wanted to end with baptism and what it means for making our way through life and into death with faith. And so I was able to start with his baptism and end with it, and then reflect on his life and his death, and in the light of those powerful things that we say and affirm when he was born and brought into the church, and that they carry us through all the way through his death. And it's also, his parents are dear friends of mine, and that was fresh on my mind because it was JJ's service at St. Margaret's in Little Rock was the last church service in person that I went to, and as far as I know, anybody else in Little Rock did before the shutdown. It was that service
from COVID. The COVID shutdown.
There were no services in churches in Arkansas the Sunday following that service. I think it was the day before the service, the burial service, the first actual case of COVID in Arkansas had happened and been identified, and the church was kind of scrambling as to we did distancing and other stuff that we're all figuring out how to do it, and by that Sunday it had been realized that we just can't have church in person now. So that service, when I was doing the book, that service was really fresh on my mind.
Felt like a good ending. I like it when you talk about older people's person's death, and in one of your sermons you talked about it being sweet sorrow, because that really was comforting to me, because when you do have an older person who's suffering and gotten infirm, and you feel guilty for wishing for their death, almost for relief for them, but at the same time, when they're gone, you feel guilty because you're like, oh, good, they're at peace, And when you called it sweet sorrow, I thought that's really exactly what it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's still grief, but it's grief that's kind of weighed with appreciation for the fact that they lived a full life, and so it's and the recognizing that death does come with mortality, and it's we're not going to be able to defer it forever.
Parenting is a guilt trip. No one ever tells you that before you're going to have kids, but you have kids, and you're like, oh wow, I'm not as good a parent as I thought I should be or could be, and you're always feeling a little bit guilty.
You're a great parent.
Oh, you're sweet. Thank you. But you're always feeling like, well, I didn't pick them up on time, or I should have done more, or whatever, And then I didn't know till my mother and father passed that being a child is a guilt trip, because when your parents pass, you have all this guilt about, did I do enough when they're dying, and did I do enough when they were alive, and could I have done this different, and all of that. And so I think the church really helps you through the guilt that comes with so much of life.
Well, we shouldn't lead with guilt about anything.
I know. Would you tell me that more often?
I mean, that's not to say that, just go out and party and do what you want. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters, but we should always lead with grace, then sort through the rest of it.
Well, I liked reading, and I think everybody should read your book that has suffered any kind of a loss, because it really helps you think about the afterlife and the continuation. It just, I don't know, it makes you really at peace at the way things are. Anybody who's suffered any loss, and a lot have during these COVID years. But now I want to talk to the Reverend about some serious stuff, but like death's not serious enough. But
yeah, what have we been talking about?
Right. Chris, you quote Thomas Aquinas a lot, all the time, and Barth, and some other people. But who is Thomas Aquinas?
Well, he was a Christian theologian in the 13th century, and who synthesized biblical faith with philosophy, particularly the philosophy of Aristotle. And so it's a synthesis of faith and reason, which is exemplary for, I think, how we should incorporate our capacity to reason with our trust and belief in God. Thomas Aquinas, for the Summa Theologiae, for every question that he's getting ready to consider, and so we're talking about 5 or 6 volumes of work, thousands of pages. Any question he's going to take up, he starts with the best objections to his own position. The world would change profoundly for the better if we would all do that. I'm going to tell you I'm going to make a claim. I'm going to tell you something that I think is true. Before I start, I'm going to tell you the 2 best reasons that I know why I'm wrong. And I'm going to start with that. It's a Thomas Aquinas. That was his method. That's one of the reasons why I so appreciate him, and I teach him to teenagers.
From the 13th century?
Yeah.
Is it really hard to read?
Yeah.
I bet. According to him, people are in most respects the same as other creatures. What sets us apart is our power to think. So
we're like other creatures in that we have, he called them the vegetative aspects and the animal aspects of being a creature. Vegetative mean like plants, like cactuses and stuff. We have capacities to reproduce and defend ourselves and grow. And like other animals, we have all these passions. I think he identifies 11 different passions. And so even before Darwin knew that we were descended with other species from common origins, Aquinas recognized that human beings are part of the creation and made us the same stuff, and for the most part. But what's distinctive about being human is our capacity to think. And then beyond that, also the fact that we were made in the image of God. But that part of it is known by faith, but just by reason and observation, we can know that we have the power to think.
Yeah, he believes in 11 human emotions. Do you write and think about those when they're in your mind and you are filing your quotes and making your notes? Do you think about those emotions, those desires that he does when you are kind of writing a sermon? You think, I'm going to write to this for this family? Yeah,
I do. And I think that and so all of that goes into what it means to be a soul. I mean, the soul has all of that. The soul's not this thing that just floats above all that animal and vegetable stuff. The soul, a human soul, is the spiritual embodiment of all of that. And so we're not just doing religion when we're talking about the stuff that transcends the stuff that makes us earthy. In the Christian faith, the Christian religion, all of that is recognized as part of what it means to be made in the image of God.
He says that the human soul is hiding in plain sight. Mm-hmm. I never think of it like that. I think of it as, I don't know, something you can't see, something you can't feel. It's just kind of a thing. But he says it's hiding in plain sight.
I'm looking at you, and you are a human soul. I'm seeing you right now.
Oh, that's a whole nother way to think about it.
Now, part of that is mortal. But the essential Kerry is who is going to die is going to that death. You and that death are going to be swallowed up in life, which is going to be you. I'm speaking from the posture of the Christian faith now, which is going to be you, but more. You are going to be. There's not going to be less of you, just the kind of the ethereal, uninteresting, unsalty parts of you, but all of that, including the salty parts of you, are going to be elevated and magnified. There'll be some, I like that. I've used this from Marilyn Robinson in sermons you've heard me give a bunch of times. She says there's two old pastors that are talking about heaven, and that one of them they agree that there's not that much we can know or should even try to say about that. There's good reasons why we don't know the details of the heavenly experience, but the Bible's not totally silent on that topic. And one minister says to the other, "Well, I just like to multiply this. Think about the splendors of the world and multiply by 2." He says, I'd multiply by 10 or 12, but that wears me out. So 2 is sufficient. And so think about the splendors of Kerry and multiply by 2. And that's your soul set free from the bonds of mortal life and into the greater life to come.
And today in our sermon we were listening to Father Hoke was talking about that we are the essence of love. Why is it so hard to keep that in our forefront? Why do we go off onto all these other things about that we are kind of made in God's image with this essence of love, but yet we end up with all these terrible thoughts in our minds all the time?
Well, we are organisms too. And that's why I think, again, Aquinas, I think, is helpful. Because life as an organism is a lot of work. Mm-hmm. And we have to get out there and earn it every day, mm-hmm. just to get food in our bellies and all of that stuff. And it's rough. And so it's not easy. Love is hard work.
It is hard work.
Yeah, love. We don't appreciate the complexity of love. I think when we hear the word, we tend to think of a sentiment. Yes. Of for somebody that we care about, and love is more than that. It's like faith. There's three. Faith is tripartite. It's a belief in the mind. I believe that something is true. Can't know that it is true. I might have reasons for believing it's true. I will have reasons for believing it's true. So it's not like I'm totally in the dark, but I can't see all the way to certainty. So faith is that, but it's also a desire. It's a desire for. It's an emotional attachment, and it's a commitment. It's a choice. Well, all of that's true for love too. So I love you, a person, when I believe that your good is as important as my own, when I desire it for you, and when I committed to act on it. So that's what love is. It's not just a sentiment. There's sentiment in it. It's in that desire. But it's more than that, and it's really hard work, and it's hard to separate it from faith, because love becomes easier or more compelling anyway when it's part of a faith that has those same things directed towards God, and where God is kind of brought into our life to help us with it.
Mm-hmm. Faith, you said theology is faith seeking understanding.
Yeah. That's a real old definition for theology. I certainly didn't invent it. That goes back to at least to St. Anselm.
So how do you have it? As well read as you are, yes, I can totally know there's more to life than what I can see. But I wonder, I have a hard time believing that Jesus is the Son of God. I don't know that if I was born on another continent that I wouldn't have religion of a different kind. I am a seeker of, I would always be someone who desires faith. I desire faith. In what you were just speaking about, I desire faith. And I'm committed to desiring faith.
Yeah. And you practice it too.
And I practice it. But how do you have it so, with such conviction you do?
Well, we can't force ourselves to faith.
Darn it.
It's so. I mean, it is something that. Ultimately, faith is an action of the Holy Spirit in a person, and where reason comes into play. For Aquinas thought this too. Is reason is important to kind of addressing stumbling blocks to it. I mean, the mind can put an awful lot in the way of faith. I mean, the world and life do put things in the way of faith. And so, we need to be able to see past some of the problems and say, well, that looks like an insurmountable problem for me believing that Jesus is the Son of God or that God even exists. And, it does help to have some education to be able to address those things. I mean, if somebody says, evolutionary science, boo, I've just scared you away from your belief in God. Well, it helps to know something about the science, and it helps to know something about philosophy and what's reasonable to believe and what's not, to be able to know, well, you just said boo, but you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
So education comes into play. And I would say that a lot of times a little bit of education will upset a person's faith. Because something that they felt secure in, well, then they found out something that they didn't know was true that presents a problem. So I'm not saying that the road is a smooth road, but I guess I can personally attest that having had a whole bunch of education, that at some point, the more I got, the more it seemed like the deeper my faith got. But I don't think that you can isolate that from other things, because faith is easier when you're also working at love. It's not, if you're not trying to love your neighbor too, it probably gets harder and harder to love God. I think that they're yoked.
Absolutely. I don't know why that is, but it's absolutely true. When you get bitter, God gets farther away.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is.
Yeah.
So why do we get bitter? Why do we have to struggle with that? Why do we have to get mad because the neighbor keeps blowing his blower while I'm trying to sit out on the front porch?
Oh, my Lord.
No, I'm serious. I get so mad about that.
Yes.
Well, that's my gripe.
Specific and relevant, yeah.
It's a beautiful fall afternoon, and I'm going to go sit on the porch, and the neighbor comes out there with his blower, and I can't sit out there anymore, and it really makes me mad, and then I'm bitter, and then God's just gone.
Yeah. God's going to take a break at that point.
All right, that was too. All right, fine. You can cut that out too, Tom. Carl. Okay, Karl Barth, another serious theologian you quote a lot. His name was given in the title of your thesis even. He describes his craft as, I thought this was interesting, the most beautiful of all sciences. And there's that word again with science. Christianity with science.
Yeah.
That was a long time ago too, right?
Well, no, Barth is 20th century, mid-20th century and early 20th century. So he wasn't talking about Christian theology as a natural science. He was talking about it as as faith-seeking understanding and in relating our faith to the world. But I love it. He called it the most beautiful of sciences, and he said, about how people come to faith. He says God doesn't convince us to believe in him by himself by arguments. He persuades us by giving us joy, and gives us joy by being beautiful.
That's so true.
And so faith is drawn to the beauty of God. That's the kind of the emotional. To make it concrete. Just in the New Testament, when Jesus, just walking through a crowd, a woman is healed because she touches his cloak. And she'd been painfully ill for 20 years. And the Bible pictures moments like that as instances of the kingdom of God becoming visible on earth. It's not always visible on earth, but Jesus again and again, it becomes visible on earth. And what the reaction is heartbreaking joy on the part of the people who's have been healed or forgiven or something like that. There's a piece in us that is ready emotionally to respond to that when we see it or know it. I mean, and a lot of times in church, it happens through music.
Absolutely. I cry in church all the time out of joy.
Yeah. And it's music speaks to that part in us in a way that preaching doesn't as effectively.
You just spoke about the Bible like it's literal, and yet you don't really believe it's literal, word for word.
Well, I believe that that the Bible is a lot of things, and I think that there's some things in the Bible which are obviously metaphorical, and there are other things in the Bible that are importantly literal, and there are other things where it's kind of hard to know. You know, what's the best way to interpret this or thing? So, one class I used to teach a long time ago was, should we take the virgin birth and the resurrection literally or not? And then I created a spectrum, and I said, well, let's add the creation in Genesis to that. So, should we take the 6 days of creation in Genesis literally? Before Darwin and modern science, I would have said, well, yeah, probably we should. St. Augustine said, well, maybe we should, but actually there's some reasons to think maybe we shouldn't because, for example, God says, let there be light on the first day, but the sun and the moon and the stars aren't created until the fourth. So those are the things that generate light. So maybe this isn't meant to be taken literally. Augustine said that.
When did he live?
4th century.
Okay.
So now we know that, no, the universe wasn't, and human beings weren't literally created in 6 days. So we're not going to take Genesis literally.
Okay.
If we're going to accept that science, and I do accept the science. So no, that's not, I'm taking that some other way than literal. The resurrection, on the other end of the spectrum, I say, well, if Christian faith is going to really stand as Christian faith, then it's got to affirm that Jesus was literally raised from the dead. Otherwise, the Christian faith goes out the window. Now, that's, in some quarters, would be considered a controversial statement that I just made, and I'll defend it. But I believe that the resurrection is not a literal event, that something that happened to Jesus so that he was dead and now he's alive again, then all that hope I offer in that book and in sermons through all these years, well, I was wrong. The virgin birth is an interesting question in that we don't need the virgin birth to be literally true for the thing that it affirms, which is that that Jesus is God incarnate on the earth to be true. That could be true without a virgin birth. I think my faith can go either way with that. I actually prefer it if it is true, the virgin birth. And I don't think it's crazy to believe that it is. But if somebody were to say, well, no, that was metaphorically, then I'd say, okay, Christian faith still works the same way without that or not. So that's my spectrum. Resurrection must be literally true, or Christianity is just wrong at a place where it can't be wrong and still stand. Genesis can't be true literally for what we know about science to be true, but that doesn't mean that it's not powerfully true metaphorically. Virgin birth is kind of interesting to think about.
Very well said. So how much time do you give to prayer and meditation a day? Because you have to deal with a lot of grief. I know you get to deal with births, and I know you get to deal with celebrations, but there's a lot of grief you have to deal with. How much do you have to meditate every day?
Well, I don't meditate in the technical sense. Early in my ministry, I did do that, but my practice changed I'm more now just a kind of an old-fashioned prayer book Episcopalian. I say the daily morning prayer every day from the prayer book, which includes readings from the Old Testament, the epistles, the Psalms, and the Gospels. And I actually pray more now that I'm retired because I have more time to pray. And I've said my prayers every day, no matter what was going on. And I've always said some version of the daily office, and had when I was dean, I was busy. But yes, I prayed. But now I get up in the morning and I might have 45 minutes to say the daily office, and I can take as long as I want to read a passage and try to understand it, and just pause in the middle and say prayers for. So if I have more time to spend on people that are on my list that have asked me to pray for. So it's more part of my life now. It's more part of my ministry now than it was when I was more active.
Busy.
For the church, yeah.
Okay. Anyone who has lost a loved one would enjoy your book. It is so good. It is called Getting On Toward Home. And the cover is a painting that your sister, that you use, because she's an artist. So where do we get your book?
It's actually, as of just a few days ago, the book is finished. It's in print. And just the paperback right now, but the hardback is coming in a couple of weeks. But you will be able to get it at Wordsworth.
On R Street in Little Rock.
Okay. And there's going to be an event at the Trinity Cathedral. It's part of the Six Bridges Literary Festival.
Oh, good.
And so I'm going to be interviewed by Dr. Neil Wyatt, who works with Arkansas Hospice. He's going to be the moderator of a panel. And we'll talk about the book. And you can buy the book there, and I'll be delighted to sign it for you. And that is on Tuesday, October the 26th at noon. And it's, of course, open to the public. And,
you got to do it at noon. What about people that work? Well, I guess at noon you can bring a box lunch.
That's why it's at noon.
I gotcha.
And we thought about doing it on a Sunday, but that got to be too complicated. And so Tuesday at noon.
Is that all you've got scheduled? You're going to do some book signings at Wordsworth?
Well, Wordsworth is going to be there with the book at Trinity Cathedral, so that's kind of, I don't know if we might do something later on, but for now it's about the book festival.
But that's your big release date.
Yeah.
October the 26th, Tuesday at noon at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in downtown Little Rock. Bring a boxed lunch. On that note, I want to say thank you for coming on. I want to remind everybody about Tuesday, October the 26th, noon at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral. You can meet the good Dr. Chris Keller at downtown Little Rock, Arkansas. Again, I'm going to say thank you, Chris, for joining us. I love talking to you. I just love you. It doesn't matter if I'm talking to you or not. In closing, I'd like to say to our listeners, thank you for spending time with us. We hope you've heard or learned something that's been inspiring or enlightening, and that whatever it is will help you up your business, your independence, or your life. I'm Kerry McCoy, and I'll see you next time on Up in Your Business. Until then, be brave and keep it up.
If you liked this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the picture of Kerry's face in the center of the screen. For more of Kerry's interviews, click either video on the right of the screen. And as always, thank you for watching.